Welcome back to American Dialectic. Today we've got an interesting conversation here for you. We want to discuss three different types of government, Jake, and I'm going to pick your brain on this one because I'd like you to define it. The three different types we're going to go after today are anarchy, so an anarchist system, a democratic government, and a Republican government.
Okay.
I'd like to discuss the nuances of each, how they're intended to function, and where are their shortcomings. So I think, if you don't mind, will you lead us off with anarchism?
Okay, anarchism. Okay, one, I want to preface with a meme. Nobody likes anarchists. But more seriously, anarchism is an idea of maximizing freedoms for all peoples as much as possible, and often the destruction of unnatural hierarchies. But there are many ways that anarchism can go ahead and be expressed. For example, the two most common ones would be called anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-communism. But there are many other versions. For example, you would have mutualism. And the meaning of it is definitely very, very deep, but the idea is that we mutually go ahead and help each other. And there are different understandings of how certain relationships are supposed to go ahead and work. For example, in anarcho-capitalism, you wouldn't have a defining government to actually define your relationships, but as far as ANCOM would be concerned, it's all about relationships with capital, where I go ahead, I have resources or money that you would possibly want, and we enter a deal together, and we go ahead and exchange freely. Whereas the anarcho-communist would go ahead and say, hey, everything belongs to everybody, and you should only take what you need. And we can say whether things work or fail a little bit later, but anarchism is a very broad and very old set of ideas as a whole. And it's very rich, and believe it or not, anarchists have actually organized sufficiently to even wage wars inside of at least Spain and a few other places.
So would you define anarchism as a sort of hands-off approach?
It's a non-existent government approach.
Go more detail, please.
As I stated, where democracy and republicanism, they would go ahead and create an artificial hierarchy where there would be an authority over you, just always there.
Okay, so when you say, forgive me, when you say an unnatural hierarchy, what you mean is one that was created by somebody with the expression of ruling over a specific area.
And a complete elimination of your ability to consent.
Let me ask you this. How would you define a natural hierarchy versus an unnatural hierarchy?
A natural hierarchy would be an example like a human being and their dog. But if you talk to a vegan anarchist, they will disagree with that being even an unnatural hierarchy.
So what about a man that's very good at, say, framing and a man that's not so good at framing? That is a hierarchy that's been created. Is that a natural or unnatural?
Naturally, you would go ahead and say, hey, it's a natural hierarchy of someone being more skilled than the other.
Okay.
But if you're an ANCOM, you would say that they both are equally entitled to a quality standard of living.
I see.
And
now,
treating them differently is unnatural, whereas an ANCAP would say naturally he deserves more, and that is a natural hierarchy. It's based off of how you perceive these hierarchies and how they are natural and unnatural. It's very subjective to the individual, and there's been hundreds of thousands of hours of debate on what is natural and unnatural in these establishments of hierarchies.
Fascinating. All right, let's move on to pros and cons for anarchism. So what is an anarchist society? What are supposed to be the benefits of a society like that?
One of the greatest benefits is that you would have a greater maximization of your personal liberties, maybe in the negative or positive sense. ANCAPs, for example, care very much about maximizing your negative liberties. They want as little interference from society and other people in your life, unless if you consent to it. Whereas to the point of, if you are liable to starve, it's not society's problem. It's not your problem. It's not up to you. Thing is, that person may die to the elements, but all the responsibility is on him. Whereas an ANCOM would go ahead and say society as a whole needs to be responsible for each other. And the idea is someone shouldn't have to do a crap job in order to survive. Someone shouldn't have to live a poor quality of living in order so that they are persuaded. It is often called manufactured consent, Whereas if you put a knife to someone's throat, like in another segment that we discussed, you are manufacturing consent for them to agree with you, despite the fact that they don't want to agree with you. They are agreeing with you under the worst possible circumstances. That's, in their mind, the problem with capital and capitalism.
So to sum up, the con would be that people are going to get left by the wayside. There will be people that will fail, and there's not hands up to get them?
Depends, again, on
the type of anarchy.
And the thing is, definitely one of the pros is that you're going to have a maximization of either positive or negative liberties. But at the same time, you're going to lose a lot of negative liberties or lose a lot of those positive liberties. Thing is, if you don't happen to have health care, and ANCOM would say we need to make sure everyone has a certain minimum level of health care, meaning if you are not healthy, they want you to be healthy in order to participate in society to a level that you feel comfortable with. And CAP, they'll say, not my problem.
So the pro would be potential maximization of
a form of liberty.
Of a form of liberty. That's fascinating. So tell me this. How would an anarchist society approach something like crime and punishment?
Again, it kind of depends on how you go ahead and perceive things. ANCAP and COM is the most common ones that you go ahead and run into. ANCAP, they refer to everything as property relations. They go ahead and say, this is my property. If you go ahead and interfere with my property, you are violating something called the NAP, the non-aggression principle,
right,
which means that my property is an extension of myself. Anything you do against my property, you can go ahead and retaliate to a degree that feels appropriate. A lot of common jokes would be, hey, you stepped on my green lawn. That lawn is mine. Let me go get my McNuke and blow your sorry ass out of the water. And an ANCAP would believe that they would have that right because they have the right to protect themselves. And all property is an extension of yourself. So you have the authority to do what is necessary to protect yourself. And if you happen to infringe on those property rights, you are at the mercy of the person who is protecting their property. And ANCOM, they take an issue with all things being defined as property relations. But if you go ahead and still try to undermine the entire collective, the collective will go ahead and deal with you collectively. So it's how much the individual person is able to go ahead and have that power over you, or the whole collective having power over you.
It's fascinating. Really interesting stuff.
There's of course a multitude of different ways, different versions of anarchy.
They're just perhaps the most common ones.
It's just the most out there, most established out there.
Interesting. Very interesting. Let's move on.
Okay.
I want to talk about a democratic government.
Okay.
If you want to give us maybe a brief rundown of how a democratic government's run.
All right. There are many versions of democracy. Democracy was originally conceived as, from the Greeks, to go ahead and create a system where the leaders would be appointed by the people. And depending on the philosophical background that you go ahead and lean on, they went ahead and said, we can only use the most privileged, knowledgeable people to go ahead and vote. Because a lot of the arguments were, you don't want children making decisions for society. They don't know what goes into society. They don't know how trade works. They don't know how politics works. They don't understand how foreign policy works. And a lot of this comes down to, in these times, owning property of some kind. They could be slaveholders, and they could be traders. And in the time of the Greeks, only about 10% of the population legally could vote under the system. And as time goes on, there are many other ways you can look at democracy, which is usually in terms of enfranchisement. And a lot of conversations come up in terms of what responsibilities come with that enfranchisement. Some of the most traditional aspects of enfranchisement is you must be willing to serve society above all else. If you are having a say in society, you must be willing to pick up the sword for society. You must be willing to die for that society. You must be willing to give to society. One of the reasons why that property owners actually had all the say is because who funded society. If you pay for society, you decide how society runs.
So
It's,
yeah, but
you can actually go ahead and see this even in our modern America, where who pays the most taxes? The rich and powerful.
Right.
So, of course, our politicians are going to tend to whatever they want so they can maximize revenue from the rich and powerful.
So a democracy would range from the most elite or financially elite among the society.
That would be a very limited enfranchisement.
Right, voting together and creating law for society, versus all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which would be everybody who's an adult in that society.
Everybody.
Yeah,
I mean, even Cuba, even in Cuba, young children actually have the right to vote.
Right. So on the far side of democracy, which would be everybody who votes, and so that's
can understand.
that sounds a little chaotic.
It can be
with everybody voting.
It really also comes down to the cultural preference. For example, if you have a strong family unit where you go ahead and talk politics and issues about what's relevant, if you have a large family, an argument can be made that your large family say matters a lot more than that person who is just sitting on his butt playing video games all day, because all the political decisions based off of that democracy is going to affect a lot more people. And that's what the most basic elements of governance is. You want to go ahead and figure out how you can maximize the most amount of consent from the governed.
Yeah, I see some pretty clear pros and cons there too. When you're talking about everybody voting, obviously, if everybody votes, you're going to get opinions that are uneducated and uninformed, but as well as the good, people who did study the subject. And weeding those out could be impossible, but it doesn't matter. Everybody's vote is weighed equally. You know what I mean? So that I could see that as causing some real turmoil, especially in today's age with fake news and sort of misinformation running rampant.
The best thing that you can get from a pure democratic system, no matter what, is those who do vote. That is how much consent that the governed has.
Right.
It's one of the reasons that you have to look at the polls for like Donald Trump or Barack Obama, Bush, Clinton, their approval ratings, because it can be a bit telling who people are going to vote for in the next election cycle, because it's telling the whole society this is how much society is consenting to his set of rules and ideals.
Right.
And
Yeah. So I could see it being able to really rein back those who would be tyrannical. You know what I mean? If everybody has a say, tyranny is pretty evident to everybody. You know what I mean? I think that when you live under a tyrannical government, it's very easy to recognize what's going on, what rights are being denied to you, as opposed to studying it from the outside. So I believe that, any form of democracy will help. I'm not saying it stops, but it'll help curb tyranny.
Until you run into one critical flaw, mob rule.
Oh, yeah.
Thing is, people are fickle. People get angry. People get frustrated. And based off of the rules of a democratic system, a democracy can turn around and become extraordinarily populist. And that's actually the direction that the world is heading towards today, because the people who were supposed to be protecting us and leading us and ensuring that our societies are being built,
they're caving to mob rule.
They are increasingly caving to mob rule. The question then comes down to, do we have too much democracy and too little of the next topic?
That's actually, as you say, that line of thinking is a fantastic segue into the next category we wanted to talk about, which is republicanism. A representative democracy, so to speak, right?
Yeah, that is exactly what republicanism is.
Give us the details on that, Jake.
So democracy goes ahead and has that problem of mob rule, and on top of that, you also brought up another valid point, the uneducated. And I'm not trying to hate on the uneducated. Thing is, you need to have a class of people in society who are up to date on legal procedure, the procedure of their democratic republic system. They need to understand the rules of that system. They need to know how to behave in that system. You can go ahead and look at Ocasio, for example. She's very young, and she is very passionate, and she has no experience in government, and she gaffes and fumbles all the way through our republic, failing at every little thing that she does.
Explain a gaffe to the audience, will you?
A gaffe would be going ahead and making a very critical and questionably fatal mistake that everyone would go ahead and recognize. For example, when we had that libertarian guy running, he was asked, how do you feel about Aleppo? And he turns around and goes, what's Aleppo?
Yeah. Yeah. Would it be fair to categorize a gaffe as a sort of a misnomer?
No, it's not a misnomer. It's just a description of what happens. And everyone makes gaffes. Everyone makes gaffes. It's just
sort of more of a faux pas.
Not a faux pas. It's just a legitimate mistake.
I could keep showing off my linguistic skills and looking for synonyms if you like.
It's just a mistake. That's all it is, and it's a mistake.
A faux pas is a social mistake.
Well, a faux pas is a little more than that, but making a mistake that is not necessarily offensive, but it shows how unknowledgeable that you are on a certain subject, meaning you can't exactly be trusted as a leader in that.
Oh, so would it be fair to say that I just gaffed that last segment?
Yes.
Do you think that was intentional? That's the real question.
We'll leave that for the viewers.
Go ahead.
But what that representative model goes ahead and does, people are able to go ahead and vote for the representatives, and these representatives can easily be judged. Are they knowledgeable? Are they unknowledgeable? Because if they're making gaffes, they're not going to be able to represent them in their interests very good because they don't know the topic. They don't know the subject. And so you can vote the representative out and get a new representative in. And what you're trying to do in this Republican system is find the best qualified person to represent your interests. It's a reason why you get a lot of lawyers into government. It's why you get a lot of people who are very skilled in managing people, in organizing. Like Obama, he was an organizer before he got into government. And he was still an attorney, a lawyer. And he was, say what you will about him, but he was very good at his job. And whether we like him in how he did his job, that's a different topic. But he was good in his job. Whereas Trump, he's actually the outlier. You don't get a lot of businessmen jumping into politics. Whereas, for example, Reagan, he actually went through some political experience before he jumped.
Right, well, and he's the next best thing to a politician, an actor.
Yeah.
And they're not far off. I mean, it's a real true point. They're very not far off.
Yes, but it comes down to, in a representative system of, which is a republic, how and who do they represent? And that is where you can run into a lot of interesting ways that a republic can work. The United States is a little special in how it works because we don't have a unicameral system.
Right.
Nebraska, fun fact, has only one legislature. We don't have a Senate and a Congress.
Interesting.
And whereas a lot of states, they actually have both. They model themselves after the United States government.
Right.
And what a lot of people misunderstand about these respective governments, in at least a representative sense, is that a Congress actually represents the interests of the people. And on top of that, you have a Senate, which is focused on representing the interests of the states. And the reason why you want this kind of system is that with a Congress, since it's purely representing the interests of the people, it's going to be prone to mob rule. Whereas if you have a Senate, you go ahead and prevent that mob rule ever taking over. But the Senate can't do a lot without the consent of the people either. So the states can't operate independently without consent. The people can't operate without other states recognizing, okay, we're okay with this. And we are able to have representation for both the interests of states, because all the states are different.
Yeah.
And the interests of the people are all different.
Well,
the fact they have to make a larger consensus than what's usually typical.
Like with democracy, I see another very glaring flaw in this representative democracy. I think that when you offer positions of power, like a senator or a president, varying degrees of power, you attract people who are attracted to power. And the last person that you want in charge is the person that wants to be in charge, if that makes any sense. Usually people that seek power, they're very specific. ENTJ, which if you're not familiar with that, it's a typology. So it's those types of people are going to be attracted to power.
Oh, yeah.
And very typically, you've heard the term...
They become demagogues.
Yeah, exactly. You've heard the term power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that you see that happen in the Senate as these people, as these senators and congressmen alike, the longer they serve, the more times they're reelected, they cave more and more and more to, as you put it, demagoguery, or to
because they have to.
It becomes about supporting your base, the people that vote for you, and less about doing what's right for America. And that's a real problem in my mind, because when you have all of these different people pulling for different things, this one wants one person and unwilling to budge, this one's unwilling to budge, and everybody in the middle, all you're doing is, it's like what we see now. It's just absolute gridlock. And it's not to get too off topic, but that's why Trump is such a great president for us right now, because he's really neither. You know, and his sort of movement has broken up a lot of that gridlock. People are starting to grind. The gears are starting to move, so to speak. So, not to get it too off topic.
Oh, no. And what's actually interesting about different Republican systems and Democratic systems, there are some leaders that are actually directly voted on by the people. And that is more similar to a democracy. What's interesting, and a lot of people forget, a lot of people say, oh, President Trump, he's the president of the people. No, that's actually a common misunderstanding, because how our process works is that when people actually go ahead and vote on the president day, it's an advisory vote, because what happens after you collect the votes, it goes ahead and goes to a couple of representatives within the state who goes ahead and acts in the interest of the state. They take into consideration of the vote as an advisory. And the reason that this is in this place is to prevent demagoguery. And they're able to go ahead, and these people are usually educated, they know how the system works, and they are loyal to the interests of the United States, but also interested and loyal to the welfare of their states. And it's very rare when people actually go ahead and go against the will of their people. It happens all the time. Well, not all the time, but it does happen. They are able to go ahead and see, okay, this person that is going to get elected, he is a terrible, terrible, terrible human being in every meaning of the word. He is so out there that we need to prevent him from gaining power. The people, I'm sorry to tell you, you fell for a demagogue. Whereas they're able to go ahead with a better education than the uneducated, say, yeah, he's not a demagogue, he might be, Trump might be an idiot according to these, but they will go ahead and they have the power to say, yeah, but he's not destructive to the Republican Democratic process. And that is our last line of defense in actually preventing demagogues, because then they go ahead and say who they vote for. Then the states go ahead, pull their electoral college points together, and we elect a president through a Republican system, not a Democratic system. And what makes it interesting is that Democrats typically, and a lot of people on the left, they actually have a preference for democracy over Republican systems. And they are actively trying to change the laws in a number of states to try to make sure that states vote in always strictly in a certain direction and give all the points to who they believe was democratically voted in, democratically elected.
Yeah.
It's a reason why you can see some presidents getting fewer votes but still win, because a republic does guarantee that.
Yeah. You know, this is a fascinating topic. It always seems real easy when you're talking with your friends over a couple of beers and you say, oh, this is what the government should do and this is how it should be. But, you know, when you really start tackling them subject by subject, different types of governments and how they function, the complexity of what it takes to rule, so to speak, over people is it's fascinating. And I don't think that there is any simple solution, and I think there's a reason that in all of the recorded history of man, the best that we've been able to come up with is still a very flawed system. Not to take anything away from what we have, because we live better than we ever have. But it's wanting to sit down and hash out, you know, how a government is supposed to work is a process that you could spend several lifetimes on and not actually reach any true conclusion on. You know,
or consensus.
Yeah, or consensus. So it's a fascinating subject. I hope that we could sit down and maybe talk about more types of government another time.
I would be interested in talking about totalitarian, dictatorship, and oligarchical systems in another video.
A little teaser for next time, guys. I think that'll do it for today.
Very good.
Hey, thanks, Jake.